So the general entrance of women in the labor force has been one of the major changes that affected labor markets in the past century. For instance, in France, labor force participation rates of married women aged 30 to 50 increased from 35% in 1960 to 90% today. How can we explain this revolution of female labor? A popular explanation is the instrumental role of early generations of working women in paving the way for later generations of women, and especially in diffusing more progressive social norms throughout society. However, there is still no large-scale empirical evidence for this long-run mechanism. And the reason is that establishing causality in this context is very challenging. The main issue is that the very factors that induce women to enter the labor force in the first place may still be at play decades later, making the working behavior of women across generations largely co-determined. In my dissertation, I offer a solution to this problem. I use World War I in France as a large source of exogenous variation in female labor force participation, and I uncover the causal mechanisms through which the working behavior of women in a given generation impacts later generations. World War I in France was a large historical shock, as 1.3 million French soldiers died during the war. And as you can see on this graph, it had a dramatic impact on the adult sex ratio, which dropped right after the war and only recovered after World War II. To measure the intensity of the war at the local level, I collected the individual military records of all these 1.3 million French soldiers who died. And I can show that locations that had relatively more military fatalities experienced an upward shift in female labor force participation after the war. And what happened is that many young single women entered the labor force after the war because they couldn't find a husband. Moreover, many war widows also entered the labor force to compensate for the loss of their husband's income. Next, I reconstruct family histories of French women across the 20th century. And what I find is that the women who entered the labor force after the war, for exogenous reasons, had a dramatic impact on the working behavior of their own daughters and granddaughters, but also of their daughters-in-law and of the younger women in their surroundings. Moreover, beyond just behavior, these women diffuse a more progressive social norm throughout society. Overall, by uncovering these intergenerational transmission mechanisms over the course of 1 century, my dissertation provides empirical evidence for an important explanation to the revolution of female labor. Thank you.